Welcome to episode 4 of Recruiter Fuel, where we're going to take the time to continue our discussion on this idea of communication. At the heart of it, communication affects our relationship with our kids, our spouses, our families, significant other, and ultimately our candidates if we're a recruiter. So let's go back to the 3 communication methods that we introduced in last week's segment, this idea of declare, debate, and dialogue. If you recall from the last discussion, declare is this idea of I'm going to tell you what I want you to hear, not necessarily what you've asked of me. I'm going to tell it because I think it's important, not necessarily you thinking it's important. Now, think about declaring to your spouse, your significant other, your husband or your wife, and how good that's going to go over. Declare, as we looked at last week, is actually the least effective way of communication because it's really a one-way discussion. It's what I want you to hear, I'm going to win, you're ultimately going to lose. The second bucket of discussion is this idea of debate. Now, the term in and of itself creates this image of this two-way conversation, but ultimately I'm trying to get you to lose because I want to be able to win. It may be overcoming objections, but in essence what I'm saying is you're wrong. It's not just me telling you something, but I'm saying you're wrong and my position is right, irregardless of if it's right or not. Now, debate, because of the two-way dynamic, is a bit stronger of a communication style and more successful than declare, but it's still not the most successful. What we realized in last week's discussion is this idea of dialogue is the most effective way to communicate. And dialogue is really about this two-way discussion that's founded not in telling, but it's founded in asking, in continuing to ask questions so that the individual that you're speaking with continues to provide you with more information and ultimately begins to persuade themselves based on those crucial questions that you need to ask. Now let's fast forward this. Think about the last recruiter training program you went to, or last recruiter book you read, or some subscribe to sales training and sales books. And think of the things that it taught you about selling and or recruiting. That you've got to have a really thick skin, true to a certain extent. That you've got to be really aggressive, kind of the used car sales approach, because you've got to be extremely persuasive. You've got to be absolutely comfortable with loads and loads and loads of rejection because people are not going to want to talk with you or engage with you. And ultimately, kind of the holy grail as taught by the traditional trainers is this idea of identify one point of pain and then exploit it for all it's worth. That in and of itself is how we were trained, many of us were trained by the traditional recruiting trainers. So if we look at that in the traditional recruiting model, let's go through each of the steps as most recruiters still continue to do today. So if we look at our model here, this idea of traditional recruiting, the first thing we focus on is this idea of building rapport. So open up any sales training or recruiting training manual and it says walk into somebody's office, look at their LinkedIn profile, or talk about the weather, something where you have this opportunity to connect with the person you're trying to engage with. The reality of it is it's very surface driven and it has nothing to do in most cases with the reason that you're reaching out to them for in the first place. And we spend about 10% of our time in doing this and creating this rapport. Now what you have to understand in this is we are in this post-trust era that we talked about in the last couple of segments. Candidates already don't trust you, yet we're only spending 10% of our time trying to build that trust, and it's often fake at best. So after you've spent the time to create this somewhat fake rapport, we move into the next step, which is this idea of needs identification, where we start asking surface level questions. In a perfect world, what's that one thing you would change in your current job? Or if you could get anything that you want, what would be the new trajectory of your career? In and of themselves, not bad questions, but we often latch on to that one point of pain that we are taught to try to exploit. So at this point, we've spent a little bit of time creating this fake rapport with the candidate, a little bit of time understanding or trying to understand their potential need, and then we move on to this next spot, which recruiters and most salespeople do really well, and that's this idea of pitch. We spend the next 50% of our time with that candidate focusing on what we want them to hear. Yes, we may cover this one need that's here, but we're spending more time telling than we are asking. Then we move into this idea of the close or overcoming objections. Now, if we haven't uncovered enough of the needs and we go right into our pitch, unfortunately, we have to spend more and more time here in trying to close the candidate. Let's put this into perspective. If we look at our 3 buckets of communication, being declare, debate, and dialogue, in this typical model, where are we spending most of our time? In fact, 80% of our time is spent in the 2 least effective modes of communication, being in declare and in debate. And almost no time was spent in this idea of dialogue. Now think of the frustration that this causes both for you as the recruiting professional and the candidate. Do you think they see this coming? Absolutely they do, because every recruiter who approaches them has a tendency to approach them in the same way. Ask 1 or 2 fake questions, try to connect about the football game that happened this past weekend, and going right into the pitch. What happens is becomes a very one-sided conversation. It becomes very selfish because it's all about me as the recruiter, and very little time is actually spent about the candidate in this idea of dialogue. Now, in order to make that transition from the traditional recruiting method to what I call active attraction, we have to turn this model completely upside down. And if we do that, we begin to build the credibility with the candidate, spending more time in this idea of dialogue. So let's see the difference between these 2 models. Here on the right, we have the model of active attraction. Now let's see how this changes or differs from the traditional model of recruiting we were all taught to do, and probably all do to a certain extent. Number 1, this idea of trust and engagement. We spend 85% of our time building rapport and asking questions. Well, let's go back. We again live in this era of post-trust. That means the candidate is already looking at us somewhat cynically. Our focus here is not on telling the candidate, but our focus here is actually asking and engaging and building trust with the candidate. If done and when done correctly, the candidate begins to persuade themselves. Under the traditional recruiting model, our focus is on trying to persuade the candidate, which is temporary, especially where we are today. In this model, by asking the right questions from the beginning, the candidate begins to understand, these are my pain points. These are the things that I have and I want to get rid of. These are my points of what I call pleasure. These are the things that I have and I want to make sure that I still get. These are the things that I want or what I am pursuing that I don't currently have. Things like title, things like additional compensation, things like additional experiences and so forth. But coming out of this, where we spend 85% of our time, we have not had to persuade. The candidate has actually persuaded themselves. When doing this and spending the time, the 85% here, in building trust and engagement, when we move into the next step of solution providing, it's only 10% of our discussion. We have to fill the needs that have ultimately arisen from asking questions of the candidate and that the candidate is using to persuade themselves, but we only need to spend a very short period of time because we're already heading in that direction. And when we ultimately move to this idea of commitment, there's less objections because we've uncovered the greater part of the need here. Look at the difference between the 2 models. If we again go back to declare, debate, and dialogue, when we're looking at the traditional model, 80% of our time is spent in the 2 least effective ways of communication. When we move over here to active attraction, or the current model that we need to be using in recruiting, 85% of our time is spent in the most effective form of communication, and that's dialogue. Only 20% or 15% of our time is spent and the less effective means of communication, but we still have to be able to do that. To make this transition, recruiters have to change their approach with candidates, move from telling and move into asking. Then and only then will their frustration start to decrease, the frustration of a candidate start to decrease, the irritation of not getting responses back will start to continue to decrease. Now in next week's section, we're going to take this one step further, and I'm going to provide you with an extremely valuable tool that you'll be able to use to quickly connect with any candidate that you come in contact with, easily getting their curiosity about what you have and what you're reaching out to them about. Until next time, change your focus. Go from the traditional method to active attraction. See you next week.